Hi everyone. So welcome to module number 2. We will be talking about traits for theories of personality. This is a 2-week-long module, so I will go over the PowerPoint at this moment. So give me a second to share the screen. Okay. So here we have trait theories. Now, before we begin, what I want to say is this is the theory that you have probably been using for most of your life without knowing it. Trait theories is this idea that we can describe individuals by certain adjectives, nouns, or other form of language. So in other words, how you describe someone typically can fall under trait theory. So trait theory or trait theories plural, is a huge umbrella term for a movement that really grew in the United States and other parts of the world, but really influenced by the pragmatic thinking of the United States. Um, Especially for those who know the history of psychology, pragmatism, especially with William James and the real strong behaviorists like Skinner and Watson, really kind of had this idea that if we should focus on the things that we can observe. And if we can observe something, we can label it, then we can predict it. So trait theories is using kind of scientific analysis or statistical analysis to really take all these words we use to describe people and see if we can hammer it down to commonalities to help understand how people work. All I just said there, essentially the nutshell of it is trait theories is, okay, how do we already describe people? And can we take those descriptions and make it systematic in order that we can understand and predict how people are going to behave? So with that, for traits, we have traits versus states. And it's important to start here because really traits are going to be a relatively stable concept. So what I mean by that is if you describe a friend as being reliable, then ideally that's going to be a stable characteristic. Means no matter what's going on, we can rely on this person. On the other hand of that, if we label someone as being uncaring or unreliable, we can assume that that's going to be a relatively stable characteristic. So basically, traits, we define them as patterns and habits of a person. Again, personality contains thoughts, feelings, and actions in someone, and a trait is really a pattern that ideally is going to be consistent. So traits can be seen as have or have nots. You either are this way or you're not, or on a spectrum. So for example, introvert versus extrovert. Now, depending on the theory and the context, introvert and extrovert is going to have different meanings. So what you see a lot in trait theory, especially with the big 5 personality, is introvert and extrovert is defined as really whether someone's shy or more outgoing. So if one's an introvert, they're most likely not to be an extrovert, right? The have or have nots. Or we could also view traits on a spectrum. So for example, from the Myers-Briggs, especially based off Carl Jung, who we'll talk about in Module 4, extroversion and introversion is defined more as this idea of how do you recharge your internal mental energy. So how do you recuperate when you kind of lose your motivation? Where do you get the energy and excitement from life? The extrovert is going to get it from the outside. The introvert will get it from the inside. So the extrovert feels real charged when they're at social gatherings or interacting with nature or the environment or really doing something external to themselves. Well, the introvert gets recharged by meditating, thinking about thoughts, being reflective, and kind of contemplating on things, sitting down with a good book and really exploring an internal world. And that can be defined as a spectrum. So depending on our mood, our moment, or even our life cycle, or what's going on in our life and our development, those extroversion and introversion can be seen more as a spectrum rather than have or have nots. So to sum up what I just said with all that, depending on the perspective, some traits you either have it or you don't, while others will be more of a spectrum. And the more that we kind of take thousands of words in the English language and hammer them down to 5 or 3 or 2 classifications, the more we narrow down, the more spectrum it has to be. And you'll see this with the Big Five personality. For the Big Five personalities on a spectrum of 5 different traits. So traits can be seen as being internal, so it influences our behavior, or external, describes and labels our actions. So internal would be typically emotions or way someone thinks about something, and external most likely is a behavior. And again, there can be variations upon that too, but it's important to understand the internal and external influences because how we assess personality is going to be determined by that. A few slides after this, we're going to go into more slides, but just to give a little taste, a little teaser about that is if I want to understand the internal world of how someone views them, I can give a subjective assessment, meaning I will have them describe their self. That's going to be an internal process. If I want to understand an external process of someone's personality, I will have someone else describe themselves, or I will observe them and then label a trait or action. I'll talk more about that in the next slide, or excuse me, a few slides from now. So that's traits. Now states, okay, are states and behaviors, emotions, thoughts, perceptions, experience that are more fluid and depend highly on the environment. So a trait we're going to say is relatively consistent. A state is going to be more fluid and depends on what's happening on in our environment. Someone can be overall pretty go with the flow and pretty are open to new experiences, but they're going to have a day when they're going to be in a grumpy mood. So we would define that as a state. So another way to think of states is think of altered states of consciousness. So that's hypnosis, mindfulness, psychotropic drugs, right? So if I have someone who has a trait that they're typically rather stressed, and we use mindfulness to put them in a state of relaxation, so they could be relaxed, and that would be a state, because typically their trait is they're rather stressed or high strung. So those are kind of the different elements to understand that states, it's going to be really dependent on the environment and is fluid. It is not going to be long term, and traits is a relatively stable human characteristic. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. So here's a brief overview of trait theory. So it's considered one of the oldest theories because we have evidence of using traits throughout culture. Anytime a culture or historical individual has tried to describe another person's personality, they typically have used traits. So we see this in Greek humors. So if someone has more, what we talk about, bile, or blood or phlegm, they used to believe that someone's personality was influenced by these humors or physical biological characteristics of fluids. And depending on how much fluid of bile, phlegm, blood, can't remember what the others were, but depending on the makeup of that, that would influence your behavior, it influences a certain trait. Same art of Veda doshas, is there are different makeups of someone's personality, and depending on what someone is presenting, they will have the particular characteristics based off that system. We see this too in astrology. So if someone, for example, my astrological sign is Cancer, so because of the astrological sign of being a crab, I typically would define someone as being a homebody, and that fits me pretty well. So as we can see, depending on these the historical time period, most cultures have, as far as we have records of, have defined someone's personality using trait theory or a version of trait theory. So most people explain others from a trait theory lens. So again, like I mentioned, you've been doing this your whole life. However you describe someone or even yourself, typically it's going to fall under a trait theory lens because you're using traits to explain how you are as a person. So overall, trait theories are very good at providing language on how people behave, but it does not provide an explanation or etiology, especially Western trait theory. So if we go back to other cultures, yes, trait theories will have an etiology, whether it be because you were born at this certain time, the way the planets aligned, that is why you act this way. So there's a cause to it. Or the reason why you're acting this way is the humors, you have more phlegm than you have bile or something like that. But in Western trait theory, especially that's really seen in the United States, there's not necessarily an understanding of why you develop that trait. So etiology is kind of the cause or what led up to that particular phenomenon. So to kind of sum that up is most of how we describe trait theory in the social sciences, it is a good way to describe behavior, but it doesn't give us a detailed explanation of why that behavior is occurring. Or nor does it provide really a way to influence that behavior, change that behavior if we wanted to. So traits tend to be very present specific. So most personality tests use a trait theory approach. You answer some questions, the result is some sort of label or trait, which is fantastic, but typically that personality assessment is not going to explain to you why you have that trait or how it's developed. And typically it does not tell you how you could change it if you so choose. So the next slide. So I've kind of alluded to this before, but there is, like anything in any of the social sciences, much debate about really the core of what it means to be human. So a big debate in psychology, especially for personality, is the person versus situation debate. So what is more powerful in determining human behavior? Is it you as an individual, or is it your environment? So trait theorists argue that behavior is highly influenced by your own personality, your own unique traits that determine what behavior is more likely going to be expressed at a given time. Because again, traits are relatively consistent, right? So if they're relatively consistent, it means that no matter what's happening on in the environment, you're most likely going to express a trait. Now again, trait theorists, because I've mentioned this already with states, will argue and accept into their theory that states are a real thing. So just because someone has a trait doesn't mean they can't act differently depending on the context. But overall, in the large scheme of things, someone's going to be relatively consistent. So with that, the person is going to be seen as more important than the environment. Situations, on the other hand, situationists, argue that the environment determines behavior rather than individual differences. So situationists argue that people behave differently in different contexts, and that it's difficult to really predict how people will behave. The situation is more important than the person. So really, where this kind of stems from is for a long time in psychology and the social sciences, we've been trying to develop theories that are relatively predictable. So for those who kind of have had other courses in the social sciences or even in physical sciences, realize or may have been exposed to this idea that social sciences in general kind of have an inferiority complex when it comes to the hard sciences like physics or chemistry or even kind of engineering or mathematics, because really it is hard to predict how people are going to behave for the most part. We don't have a guarantee way to describe, okay, we understand how this person is, and I can 100% tell you how they're going to act. That's just not how people work. There's too many variables into it. And so with that, that's why we have these debates on whether the person is really in charge of how they're going to express their personality, or is it going to be the situation? Now, really, most likely, the answer to this, it's a spectrum. That's really what I want you to take away from trait theory is there's going to be a spectrum where, yes, there's going to be times when our own personality is going to trump the environment, and vice versa. There's going to be time when the environment influences more than the personality does. So debate still exists today, and really the big question is, are traits a real thing? Now, depending on your own perspectives and own personal experiences, some of you are going to lean more toward trait theory, where others are going to lean more toward the situationist. Okay, so kind of a similar view is Emic and Etic views of traits. Emic, and again, I may be pronouncing these words wrong, so bear with me. Emic is the person's views of their own traits. So when we take this perspective, we're really trying to understand how the individual perceives themselves. We're trying to step into their shoes and really understand how they make sense of the world. So this is kind of similar to phenomenology or qualitative studies. If I really want to understand someone's personality, I can choose to understand how they perceive themselves. And with that, most of our personality tests that we use take an Emic perspective, for the tests are typically self-administrative and subjective. So whether it's the BuzzFeed quizzes, or if you were given the Myers-Briggs or the Minnesota Multiphasic MMPI, or even a Big Five personality assessment, you are answering those questions from your perspective. So that's important to remember. We're going to get really deep into Myers-Briggs in Module 4. But right now, Myers-Briggs type indicator is a really popular personality assessment. And if you spend any time on the internet, I'm sure you've come across it. In Myers-Briggs type indicator, there's 4 letters that someone's given to explain their personality. And so like if it's an ENFP, an INTJ, etc., there's 16 different types. And why I'm talking about this is there's a lot of information that takes these types and puts labels on historical or current celebrities. So think of any historical figure, any current celebrity, and even fictional characters, and you most likely can find someone who has labeled them with a Myers-Briggs type. Now, the thing to remember is that in theory, the Myers-Briggs is an Emic perspective, meaning how you get your results is you take it subjectively, okay? When someone is labeling someone else's traits, that's Etic. So traits are observed outside the individual's perspective. So when you describe yourself, that would be Emic. When you describe someone else, unless you really, if you're only going by observation of that person, that's Etic. So Etic perspectives would be described as traits, describe a trait through observation. So if I have a friend who I feel stressed out, I could say, hey, so-and-so is stressed out. But from their Emic perspective, they may not be stressed out. They may be feeling cool, calm, and collective. So examples would be watching how a person acts in a situation and or interviewing other people about the person's personality. So for this assignment for this module is we're going to kind of combine these two, where you're going to describe yourself in 5 words, so a trait perspective. Then you're going to ask someone to describe yourself using a trait perspective as well. So they'll describe you in 5 words. And then you're going to compare the two. So we'll have both an Emic and Etic perspective that's being taken place. So real world examples of Etic would be, letters of recommendation, or personal references, or even in the court of law, some character statements. So really it's someone else describing your behaviors. So to take another step back, and even just from reading the BuzzFeed assignment, what's really common when a person takes a personality test, especially one that is subjective, so asking to rate or answer from their viewpoint, it is common for someone to feel that it is hard to take a personality test because it depends on the situation or the context. So what I mean by that is we are with ourselves 24/7. We understand the complexities of being human. We understand that there's times that we do have certain traits, so we can be relatively consistent, but we also have experienced many different states and situations and know that depending on the situation, sometimes I'm this way, sometimes I'm not. That's kind of the nature of being that way. While someone observing us is not typically with us 24/7, and even if they are, they don't know what's going on internally for us, and so can have a different perspective of who we are. So this is important to understand when we're looking at personality, because whose perspective we're asking is going to vary depending on what's going on, or excuse me, how we define it. So for example, for myself, I am an ENFP, so the E is extroverted, I is intuitive, F is feeling, and P is perceiving. Again, we'll talk more about this in Module 4. Why I'm sharing this is because when I take an MBTI, I get extroverted. But if you asked people who are close to me, friends, family members, colleagues, even clients that I've worked with, they will tell you that I'm introverted. Okay? So observationally, I will get an introverted trait, but subjectively, for whatever reason, I tend to score high and extroverted. So that's just something to keep in mind, that depending on what perspective we're taking, we may get different results. In addition to that, for theories of personality, trait theory typically takes an etic perspective. It means we're observing someone else's behavior for the most part. Now, we'll get into theories where there's going to be more of an emic perspective on really trying to understand someone's perspective or sense of the world. So we'll cover more into detail as we continue with that. But to sum up this slide, because I know I'm talking a lot of different points, but to sum it up is personality can be described from observing someone, so an outside perspective, or understanding someone's internal perspective, and those two elements can contradict. Okay, so Gordon cannot speak. Gordon Allport's trait theory. So he's one of the major pioneers in Western psychology regarding trait theory, and he fits well into kind of the zeitgeist of American psychology in the early 20th century. So the founding of American psychology was really a pragmatic view. So basically, it was highly influenced compared to European and even Asian psychology and African psychology that was being developed at this time of how to understand people. Is the Western psychology really was focusing on how can we observe someone, and it was a strong rejection of the psychoanalysts who were really trying to understand someone's perspective and personality symbolically. And so what we have in Western psychology is we're trying to understand someone from a scientific element. So what I mean by that, Allport believed that the study of personality should focus on the present. So we don't necessarily need to know why someone has developed this trait or what past influences has created a personality, but what is happening presently and what is currently being displayed. Like many American psychologists, he felt there was not a need to explain the development of the personality. Instead, psychologists should focus on what's being observed. So he falls in line with, especially with the behaviorists of J.B. Watson, that I don't need to know what's going on in the mind of an individual. I can just study the behavior. So Allport described kind of 3 levels of traits. So a cardinal trait is one that dominates and shapes the personality. When you describe someone, you're most likely going to use a cardinal trait. When you describe yourself, most likely it'll be that too. Central traits are characteristics that are universal and found in every person. And typically, central traits are going to be emotion-based. So what we have could be honesty, jealousy, and anger. So central traits also can become a state depending on if we want to use that language, meaning that those traits are going to be coming up situationally. Secondary traits, again, are going to be seen only in certain circumstances. So, but I want to kind of elaborate more on this because this does not necessarily have to be situationalist. Because what I mean is there's going to be certain circumstances that bring up certain traits. But for example, let's say someone is relatively calm, so that would be their cardinal trait. And their central trait, or excuse me, they're rather calm. They're not loud. They're quiet. They don't get emotional, etc. So that could be cardinal, and maybe we have some central traits in that. But on every Sunday, when they're watching the Dolphins, they show anger. They're yelling. They're swearing. They're doing all that element with it. So that would be a secondary trait because it's a rare circumstance. It's only seen in certain circumstances, but it's a relatively stable trait because it happens for 16 weeks starting in the fall and is relatively consistent. Okay, so that would still be a trait rather than a state using this model. So really, from using Allport's trait theory, to really understand someone, we want to understand all levels to really kind of paint a picture of someone's personality. Okay. A very common real-world applications of trait theories are career assessments. So trait theory is the most widely used, currently is the most widely used, it may be changing, in career counseling and career vocational development. So career assessments typically measures one's personality using a trait approach. So again, describing someone's rather stable characteristics. The idea is to match the individual's traits, so that's the person, with a workplace where those traits are typically expressed. So environment, okay? So this is really based off Midwestern career development, especially developing in the 20th century, what we call the person environment fit model, where, okay, you take a person, this is their personality, and then you match them to an environment where that personality traits can succeed well in accomplishing those work tasks. So most career assessments are created by assessing a sample of people who work in a particular profession. So the idea is that professions are going to have unique psychology profiles, and that we are going to match someone's psychology profile to find a field of work that will allow them to be successful. So the best way to kind of find a real world explanation is already, you may have noticed this in colleges or talking to other people, that there can be similar psychological profiles depending on what major someone picks, right? So there's clearly a lot of stereotypes with that as well. But what's interesting is on college campuses, when someone introduces themselves, can be common to explain what major they're in. And then that major is almost like a personality defining characteristic. And the idea that certain professions are going to have similar psychological elements to that. So you may have already experienced that depending on your personal experiences. So again, with trait theory, what you have is the use of statistical analysis that averages the typical traits and design questions based off those traits. The one thing that's missing a lot of time in career research using a trait theory perspective is, yes, we can use trait theory's assessments and personality elements to understand the makeup of a profession, but we can lose the qualitative element where we don't always understand if people really even like that profession. So what I mean is, you may have the skills to be in profession A, but personally, profession A sounds miserable to you. And if you're miserable, then that's going to create obviously disruptions in your work life. So That's something to keep in mind because most of us have been exposed to career assessments at some time in our life, and will continue throughout our career most likely. There's a lot of critique developing with career assessments using trait theory. So the current critiques is that career assessments can be deterministic. Okay, so I don't know now what happens in high school guidance, but there was definitely a time in the United States where a guidance counselor would give you a personality assessment for career related tasks. You would take it, and it would be easy to be like, all right, well, here you go. You scored high on this, so says you should be a mortician. So here's some information on being a mortician and look into it. It can feel very deterministic. So, and the other element is, especially with most personality assessments, not even just career related, but in general, is a lot of the people providing those assessments are not adequately trained in using and interpreting the results. The biggest thing to remember with personality assessments or any psychological measurements or psychometric testing is that any test is flawed. That's the key. There's going to be some error in any testing. And that's what's lost a lot of time when people provide interpretations is there could have been error in the way someone took the test. They may have been distracted. There may have been something going wrong with the assessment. Let's say they're using a computer and their internet was slow, or they're using a pencil and paper test and the pencil breaks. That's clearly going to create a different environment. If you're stressed out taking a personality test, probably going to show up that you're stressed. And with that too is to understand historically a lot of these assessments were designed with populations that were not diverse. So for a long time in psychology, a lot of assessments were based off either college students, and there was a long time in the United States where college students were particularly white males. And we also see that there's not a lot of diversity in career assessments, that we don't have, career assessments can be biased on the population, can be biased on the socioeconomic status, etc. So whenever we're taking a personality assessment, we have to be in mind that the statistical analysis or the group that it's based on, we may not be part of that group. Therefore, there's a potential error in that assessment. In addition with this, there is a growing trend in career counseling right now that many trait models are no longer effective because these trait models were developed in the 20th century. And this is a critique not just for trait theory, but for all the theories that we're going to be talking about in this class, where most of these theories were well established in the 20th century and became icons, by the 1970s and on. So trait theory really kind of developed in the 30s. Humanistic psychology really, we'll talk about in module 3. Humanistic theories blossomed in the 60s and have not changed at all since then. The psychodynamics were started in the late 1800s, and there has been some changes in those theories. But again, those 1800s European perspective, when we get into the social and cognitive behavioral element, those are, again, kind of have a similar tradition of trait theory where they started to really blossom in the 1930s. In this class, the most modern approaches that we'll be talking about are biological perspectives. So what I'm going back to is that when we're doing career assessments with trait theories, many of these theories were developed in the 20th century. In the 20th century, the world of work has greatly changed since then. So this idea of matching someone's personality with their environment worked well when careers were relatively stable and there was a chance to grow. So many of us may be familiar with this idea that in the United States, especially in the 20th century, If you started with a company, you could be working with that company until you retire. And there was a relatively rather stable perspective. That's very rare. Where that used to be the norm, that is a huge exception to this. And now what we're seeing is work, especially for an individual, is rather fluid. So you most likely you have already gone through different career changes, and it is expected that as you continue in your life and development, you'll go through different career changes as well. And so the theories that we use for career most likely need to be updated, for the world of work force has greatly changed since these theories were developed. All right, I'm going to step off my soapbox and let's move on to the next slide. So this is a very common career trait theory known as RIASEC, developed by John Holland. Again, if I remember correctly, this was the 1940s. I may be off when this was developed, so put that to the side. RIASEC stands for realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. And how this works is someone is given a RIASEC assessment. For example, a really common one is called ONET. This is a free assessment that you can use online. It's through the Department of Labor, and it gives you a RIASEC score. Now, typically, you will have, let's see if, nope, I can't use my mouse. Typically, when you get an assessment, after you take a RIASEC assessment, you're given 3 letters. So, for example, I am an SIA, Social, Investigative, Artistic, and what we'll see, 3 letters are typically combined. So the reason why RIASEC is designed this way is you will have traits that typically cluster together. So an ASI clusters together, an SEC can cluster together, an RIA, etc. They're kind of like in this wheel because they can go together. It is possible, it is rare, but it's possible to have traits that actually do not cluster together. So for example, I could have someone that's an SRI, okay? Or I could have someone that's a CAR. Those are rare, but they are possible. So I will explain what these mean next. Next slide. Okay, so here's the model continued. Now, again, you most likely are going to have 3 traits because, again, we're complex beings and there are many different professions out there that are based off these, or excuse me, there's many different professions that have a combination of these traits. So someone who scores high on realistic, and again, remember, you can score high on different elements, but realistic is what we call a doer. So they like to work with things, and they prefer concrete problem solving or over abstract theory. So they like to do something hands-on. They like to see their product finished. So a doer could be a carpenter or something that comes to mind, where you like to work with things and you like to problem solve or fix something. So engineering, carpeting, construction, etc. Investigative is our thinkers. They like to work with data. So they prefer individual activities versus group activities. So a data analyst or an investigative researcher, someone working in a laboratory, would fall high on the thinkers or investigative trait. Artistic is a creator, likes to work with idea and things, more emotional decision making versus rationalistic decision making. So anyone who designs something creatively could fall high under artistic. And again, we could have a combination of all these. We could have a carpenter who is realistic, investigative, and artistic. They may be like creating some sculpture out of wood and they like to, prefer individual work versus group activities. Hopefully you're kind of getting the gist that we can combine these and there can be variations depending on the person. So I'm going back to this. High-end social scoring would be defined as a helper. They like to work with people, rather work in groups than individual activities. Enterprising, they're the persuaders. They like to work with people and data. Their values include reputation building, power building, and status building. And finally, conventional is the organizers like to work with data and things, value structures, self-control, and order. So there's a link to ONET, and you will get a score. And then, unfortunately, ONET is very complicated when it comes to finding a way to connect your RIASEC letters to a profession. So what I suggest is you find what the three highest letters you have, the scored the highest in, and then you can search that on Google. So again, I am SIA, and then I can search that on Google, and then there will be professions that are SIA types. And a difference, what I also suggest is you can change the order of those scores. So I could be an ASI, an IAS, an AAIS, etc. And different professions may come up with that. Okay, so the next very common personality that most of you probably have already been exposed to in some way is the Big Five. So Big Five is I'm trying to think of the word, conglomeration, yeah, conglomeration of a lot of different trait theories and trait theory research throughout the years. And essentially what it was, okay, we start out with thousands and thousands of words from the dictionary, and then using statistics, we could narrow out all those words into 5 classifications that are on a spectrum. Okay, so what I mean by that is for the Big Five, the 5 types or traits are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. So you'll hear a way to remember this is ocean or canoe. Those are all the letters that we have. So again, remember it's a spectrum. So depending on the assessment you use, there's a lot of them out there. There's a few that are free on the internet, but I would not trust those results. I've taken them. There's some that I think are too simplistic and the results are too complicated. And the ones that seem to be really good that I'm like, oh, hey, I was taking this test and I liked it. And when I finished the results, it was asking me to pay or sign up or do something like that. So they are out there, but I would be really leery of Big Five personality assessments for free. But anyway, I digress. So how this works is we have the different types, and depending on our scores, we're either going to be high or low in these types. So if someone's low in extroversion, they're going to be defined as an introvert. Now, again, I really want to reiterate, depending on the frame of reference we're using, introvert and extrovert is going to have a different definition. So from the Big Five, if I am introverted, I will be seen as quiet, withdrawn, and unassertive. If I'm using the word introvert as a Jungian analyst, introvert means I get my psychological recharge, or I get more energy and motivation from reflecting on my internal experiences rather than dealing with the external world. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies that there can be different definitions depending on them. So we have agreeableness. Again, if you're low in agreeableness, you'll be aloof, easily irritated. And if you're high in it, you'll be warm, considerate, and good-natured. So what I really want to emphasize with all of this, it is hard to not talk about the Big Five or personality theories in general and understand that there's no doubt hidden or implicit values when we're assessing personality. We are in a culture that no doubt highlights or rewards extroversion. And depending on your score, you can be labeled as undesirable, aloof, or easily irritated compared to warm, considerate, or good-natured. So what's interesting with the Big Five If you score low on them, it's almost like a pathological diagnosis where you have unfavorable traits. So if you're conscientious, if you're low, you're impulsive, you're carefree. Emotional stability, if you're low, you're moody, tense, lower self-confidence. And if you have low in openness, your narrow field of interest, like the triad. So anyway, there's a lot of research on the Big Five comparing it to many different elements of life in the United States and the world in general. What you see a lot in psychology examples is that typically people who are defined successful are going to score high on the Big Five personality traits rather than low. So really, you'll see this a lot in business literature and even career development, is that, there's an emphasis on uh, giving jobs or opportunities to individuals who score high in the Big Five because they're going to be more likely to be successful rather than the low on the Big Five. And again, this is a trait theory, so there's really very little understanding in the theory as a whole on what causes these traits or what allows these traits to grow and develop. Now, there is no doubt ways that have been combined to this. Again, there's a lot of research on the Big Five out there. You can always find more on it, but just understand too that there is an inherent value judgment that ideally or implicitly it suggests that a more acceptable individual should score high on these traits. So I understand it's important to know the Big Five. It's used quite a bit in research and even in the working world. All right, next slide. I feel like I am rambling. Anyway, this is the last slide, I think. Yes. Finally, another very common personality assessment is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI. It is popular and highly comprehensive personality assessment, and it mainly focuses on psychological traits. So, the MMPI is really trying to give labels and definitions, and essentially these traits are not acceptable in our society. So what I mean by that is the MMPI is highly pathological or mental illness focused or mental disordered, and it's really trying to give a label or classification to some sort of prevalent disorder that we label as pathological or an illness. So with that, why I'm talking about the MMPI is because, again, it's a real commonly used personality inventory. It's one of the gold standards. There is a lot of criticism of this personality. Like any assessment, as I mentioned before, kind of went on my soapbox earlier, there are flaws in any assessment we give. There's always going to be some sense of error in any assessment we give to determine someone's personality. So the MMPI was originally developed in the 1930s. So again, the growth of kind of the trait theories in the United States. In addition to this, it is highly influenced on psychoanalytic or psychodynamic thoughts of personality. So we'll talk more about that in Module 4, but it really takes the view that individuals are going to be pathological and that pathology is rather stable rather than there can be situations or growth depending on that. There's been a number of revisions, there's been a number of updates, and there's multiple versions. One popular version is the MMPI-2, so it's the newest full version of that, and it consists of 567 true and false questions. So it is highly comprehensive, probably the most comprehensive trait theory assessment, or trait assessment we have. If you want to know all your neurotic qualities and all your pathological traits, the MMPI will find it, or at least give you some sort of characteristic of it. In addition to that, the MMPI has elements to tell whether or not you're lying, or at least there's a very different type of scales. There's scales that try to understand whether or not you are hypochondriac, explores different roles of, what, uh, I'm just blanking. Yeah, so we have hypochondria. We also have psychotic tendencies. There's a whole list of them, and it's also to show how neurotic or sense of reality you have. So clearly, I think you're seeing my bias come through as I talk about the MMPI. But anyway, the MMPI, it's used in clinical settings quite a bit to determine mental health diagnoses. And this is why I'm mentioning it, because you may be exposed to the MMPI. It's used quite a bit in our society. So we can have it for mental health diagnoses. It's used quite a bit in clinical and psychological research. The MMPI and the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health kind of work hand in hand when we're trying to study abnormal psychology. It's used quite a bit in our legal system, and it is used quite often in business settings to screen potential employees. So that's something to keep in mind with it. There's a lot of debate on the accuracy of the MMPI, the ethics of the MMPI, and even the cultural considerations of the MMPI. But again, I'm biased. To be truthful, I have never been trained to use the MMPI, so I'm sure if I was trained to use it, I may have a different perspective of it. That's kind of that etic perspective, and I'm taking, so I'm taking kind of the outsider perspective, whether if I was in it, I probably would have a different one. So to summarize all of this, trait theories are really a way that we're most comfortable using already in our lives. We use trait theories to describe certain characteristics of someone's personality. Inherently, we believe that trait theories or traits are relatively stable. We do accept this idea of states that depending on the circumstance, someone may act differently than they usually do. In addition, that we also need to understand that trait theory has limitations, like any theory. It does really good at giving a description of current behavior, but doesn't always provide why that behavior came, nor does it take a very growth-oriented viewpoint. Trait theory, you're going to be exposed probably throughout your life. Any assessment you do most likely has a trait theory perspective. And what I really want you to take away is that always remember that tests can have flaws and errors when you're taking a personality assessment, that depending on whether we're taking a person's perspective, so the internal perspective, or an external perspective, we may get different results. And that it's easy when we're using traits to lose the person. It's easy to focus on the diagnostic label or the results of the test rather than who they are. So for example, you could just see me as someone who is, extroverted or introverted or neurotic or high on agreeableness, all that, but you may lose who I am as a person. So in conclusion, trait theories aren't going to go away, especially throughout this class. That we'll see there's going to be a combination of traits, concepts, even in the biological perspectives. In the psychodynamic perspectives, 100%. And really, they'll kind of come up again when we get into the positive psychology, where traits theory turns into strength-based theory. So, thank you for listening to all this. I hopefully did not confuse you. And hopefully, if I did, you can always send me an email with that. Have a good day. So I'm going to end the video. And we're going to stop share. Okay. And end.